Right now, somewhere, a woman is noticing something attractive about an older man, and he has absolutely no idea he's doing it. He's not flexing, not performing, not even aware that anything is happening at all. He might be ordering coffee, holding a door, or simply sitting quietly while everyone else fills the silence. And in that completely unremarkable moment, something registers. Most men spend years operating on a version of attractiveness built for someone in their 20s. Sharp jawlines, smooth skin, fast energy. And when that version no longer fits, they assume the window has simply closed. But that assumption is based on the wrong system entirely. There's a different set of signals that becomes more visible with age, not less, and almost nobody explains what they actually are. Some of these signals are things you're already doing without realizing it. Others are things you've spent years quietly trying to fix without knowing they were never the problem. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what these signals are, 8 of them, and most have nothing to do with how you look at all. You've seen it before. A man walks into a room, nothing remarkable about his clothes or his face, and somehow people notice him anyway. Nobody could quite explain why if you ask them. He wasn't dressed differently from anyone else, wasn't doing anything that drew attention on purpose, and yet, for a moment, the room shifted slightly toward him. This is where most explanations of attractiveness go wrong. They focus entirely on features, as if a face or a body is a fixed score that either qualifies or doesn't. But attractiveness, especially past a certain age, works less like a score and more like a signal, something broadcast through behavior, pacing, and presence, picked up by other people almost entirely below conscious awareness. Think back to someone you've met who had this quality. Chances are, if you tried to describe what made them stand out, you'd struggle to point to anything specific. That's not a failure of memory. That's the nature of the signal itself. It's read, not seen. Once you understand that attractiveness is a set of signals rather than a fixed trait, the first one is something you're already doing. You just don't know it's working. There's a reason certain men seem to take up space comfortably, without trying. And it has nothing to do with size or posture in the way you'd expect. The first sign is stillness, and closely connected to it, unhurried movement. Researchers who study nonverbal communication have long linked rapid, jerky movement with anxiety, and slower, more deliberate movement with a state of internal calm. This isn't about moving in slow motion or performing relaxation. It's about not rushing the small things, taking a moment to actually sit down rather than dropping into a chair, finishing a sentence before reaching for your phone, letting a pause in conversation simply exist instead of rushing to fill it. Picture a man at a table who, when asked a question, takes a breath before answering. Not because he doesn't know what to say, but because he doesn't feel the need to prove he knows instantly. That half-second pause reads as something most younger men can't fake, because at 20 it often looks like hesitation. At 50, it reads as composure. Of course, this doesn't mean every slow-moving person is magnetic. Someone who's simply tired or distracted moves slowly too, for entirely different reasons. The difference is whether the stillness feels grounded or absent. The common mistake is men who, feeling self-conscious about their age, try to seem more energetic than they naturally are, speaking faster, moving quicker, as if matching a younger pace will offset the years. That question about rushing leads directly into the next sign, because it's about something most men actively try to fix, and shouldn't. If you've ever caught yourself in a mirror and focused on a line you didn't used to have, there's something about that line you've never been told. The third sign is the lines on your face, specifically the ones that come from expression rather than simply from time. Psychologists who study facial perception have found that lines formed around the eyes from genuine smiling, sometimes called crow's feet, are processed differently than other signs of aging. They're read as evidence of an emotional history, proof that a face has spent years actually expressing things, rather than holding a single, careful expression to avoid wrinkles. Picture a man laughing at something genuinely funny, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening as his face fully commits to the expression, rather than a tight, controlled smile that barely moves anything. That full, unguarded expression, lines and all, is what reads as warm rather than worn. Now you might be thinking, isn't this just something people say to make aging feel better? not according to how perception actually works. A face that moves freely, lines included, is consistently read as more approachable than a smoother face that moves cautiously, almost as if protecting itself. The mistake many men make is becoming self-conscious about these lines appearing, which paradoxically causes them to smile less fully, less often, removing the very expressiveness that made the lines meaningful in the first place. That question about the voice matters more than you'd think, because the next sign isn't something she sees first, it's something she hears. Picture a conversation where one person answers instantly, filling every gap, and another who pauses for a moment before speaking. One of these reads as nervous. The other reads as something else entirely. The fourth sign is the way you use your voice, specifically a slightly lower register and an unhurried pace. Vocal researchers have noted that lower-pitched, slower speech is processed by listeners as a marker of calm authority, partly because anxiety physically tightens the vocal cords, raising pitch and speeding up speech without the speaker even noticing. A man who lets his natural pitch settle, who doesn't rush his words to fill silence, is, without intending to, signaling something his body has learned over decades. Picture someone being asked an unexpected question at dinner, and instead of immediately filling the air with, or restating the question back, he simply pauses, looks slightly to the side as if genuinely considering it, and then answers in a measured tone. That pause is doing more work than the answer itself. Of course, this isn't about deepening your voice artificially. A forced low tone reads as performative almost instantly, which defeats the entire purpose. The real shift is pace, not pitch, slowing down enough that your natural voice has room to be heard. The common mistake is men who, in an effort to seem engaged or interesting, talk faster and more, when often saying less, more slowly, has the opposite and more powerful effect. That question about physical wear and change matters most when it comes to the next sign, because it's the one most men assume works against them. Remember what I told you at the start, that the thing making you attractive right now isn't something you've ever consciously managed. We're getting closer to what that actually is. The fifth sign involves something most men have spent years quietly trying to minimize: the visible evidence of a life that's been lived in a body. This includes things like hands that show the texture of decades of use, a build that's softened or changed shape, skin that no longer looks the way it did at 30. Behavioral scientists who study trust and competence perception have found something counterintuitive here. Visible signs of physical experience are often unconsciously associated with capability, the same way a well-used tool looks more trustworthy than one still in its packaging. Picture a man's hands resting on a table during conversation. Not manicured, not hidden in his lap, just resting there, weathered in the ordinary way that hands become weathered from decades of using them. There's nothing performative about it. It's simply there, visible, unbothered. Of course, this isn't a blanket statement. There's a difference between a body that shows signs of having lived an active life and one that shows signs of neglect. And people do perceive that difference. But the specific anxiety many older men carry, that visible aging itself, the texture and change, is inherently unattractive, doesn't match how this is actually perceived. The mistake is treating every visible sign of age as something to apologize for or hide, when often the attempt to hide it is more noticeable than the thing itself. That question about style leads into a sign most men get backwards, because they assume more effort always looks better. It doesn't. There's a particular kind of man who looks like he knows exactly who he is before he's said a single word. And it usually comes down to something surprisingly simple. The sixth sign is restrained, consistent personal style. Not following trends, but having a small, well-fitted personal uniform that doesn't change much from week to week. There's a principle in perception sometimes described as pattern recognition building trust. When something is consistent, the brain processes it faster and with less effort, which translates into a feeling of ease around that person or thing. A man who tends to wear the same few colors, the same general silhouette, clothing that actually fits rather than clothing that's simply current, becomes visually familiar in a way that reads as self-possessed. Picture two men at the same event. One in something clearly trend-driven but slightly ill-fitting, adjusting his collar or sleeves throughout the evening, and another in something simple, slightly worn in, that he clearly isn't thinking about at all. The second man isn't trying harder. He decided at some point what works for him and stopped relitigating it. Of course, this doesn't mean style doesn't matter or that anything goes as long as it's comfortable. Fit and care still matter enormously. But chasing trends as a way of seeming current often backfires because it signals the opposite of the self-knowledge it's meant to convey. That question about humor sets up the next sign because the way a man laughs and what he laughs at says more than most men realize. There's a difference between a man who jokes about himself because he needs you to disagree and a man who jokes about himself because it genuinely doesn't bother him. The seventh sign is self-directed humor, but a very specific kind. Psychologists distinguish between self-deprecating humor that's actually a disguised request for reassurance and humor that comes from a place of genuine settled comfort with one's own quirks or limitations. The difference often isn't in the words themselves, but in what happens afterward, whether the person seems to be waiting for a response or has simply moved on. Picture a man making a light joke about forgetting where he put his glasses, again, and then continuing the conversation without pause, without glancing around to see if anyone found it endearing. He's not performing self-awareness. He's just mildly amused by himself, the way you might be amused by a quirky habit of an old friend. That ease, the moving on, without needing anything back, is what separates this from humor that's quietly fishing for, no, you're not that old, or no, you're still sharp. Of course, context matters. Everyone occasionally makes a joke that is, on some level, seeking reassurance, and that's simply human. But as a pattern, the difference is noticeable, and it shapes how secure someone feels to be around. That final sign is the one that ties everything else together, and it's also the one almost nobody notices in themselves, because by the time it shows up, you've stopped looking for it. Here's the one almost nobody talks about. Because it isn't something you do. It's something that happens to other people after you've already left the room. The eighth and final sign is the emotional after effect you leave behind. Specifically, how people feel about themselves after spending time with you. This connects to something sometimes described in psychology as affective residue, the lingering emotional impression someone leaves, separate from anything specific they said or did. It's why you can often remember exactly how a conversation made you feel, while forgetting most of what was actually discussed. A man who listens fully, who doesn't redirect every story back to himself, who responds to what someone says rather than waiting for his turn to speak, leaves people feeling slightly more interesting than they felt before the conversation started. That feeling doesn't fade quickly. People remember it, often without remembering why. This is the sign that quietly outweighs the previous seven, because all of those, the stillness, the voice, the lines, the style, are things people notice about you. This is what they notice about themselves. And once you start noticing how people feel after being around you, there's a natural next question. What happens in those first few seconds before any of this even has time to register? Which is exactly where we're headed next. So here's what all 8 of these actually have in common. None of them are about looking younger, trying harder, or competing with a version of yourself from decades ago. Each one, the stillness, the lines, the voice, the hands, the style, the humor, and finally the feeling you leave behind, comes from the same underlying source, a kind of ease that simply can't be rushed into existence. You don't need to practice these or perform them or check yourself for all 8 at once. Most of them are already present in some form whenever you're not actively trying to be something else. So tell me, which of these 8 signs do you think you already have without realizing it? Comment the number, 1 through 8. Next time, we look at the exact moment, under 5 seconds, when a woman decides an older man is interesting rather than just fine.